Hi, my name is Sarah Sefton. This is my final presentation for Anthropology 242 summer semester. The topic that I have chosen for my final paper and my final presentation is Integrated Education in Rural Alaska Native Communities. What does that mean? As an overview, first it starts with the integration of Alaska ways of knowing and living into modern educational systems. This includes a deep respect for the culture and knowledge of the culture, and then how to integrate that into Western educational systems currently in place in Alaska Native communities. Also, integrating those cultural principles into the education system as a whole to include curriculum and planning. Holistic education, teaching the whole student as well as integrating subject matter within itself. Community participation in the education process, both inside the classroom and expanding the classroom to include the community. The effect of global influence on Alaska Native communities as it applies to current education, in particular Western standards of education, and how we can integrate traditional ways with those standards. And finally, Alaska Native teacher training as being important in adding community value and teacher retention and the issues that go along with that. Integrating culture into the curriculum starts with a deep respect and knowledge of the culture, and both administrators in schools in rural communities as well as the educators need to understand traditional ways of learning. As Barnhart and Coagle said, their traditional education processes were carefully constructed around observing natural processes. This is something that in Western education we've moved away from in large part, and something that is vital to Alaska Native communities in particular. Combining the Western classroom setting and the traditional Alaskan ways of learning is something that has long been neglected. Rather than trying to combine the two, we've instead just tried to force the Western ways of educating into these communities, and it's been a one-way street in that way. What we need is a more meaningful two-way cultural transaction in adopting traditional lifeways as curriculum. Not only reading a history lesson that is specific to Alaska or to the area of Alaska the rural community is located in, but deeply integrating lifeways and traditions into that curriculum in order to add value to the student, to the family, and to the community as a whole. Holistic education involves teaching the whole student, being their mind, their body, and their spiritual life as a whole being, rather than only teaching the mind as has become common in Western education. This also involves integrating subject matter so that each of the various subjects works together to create a whole education, rather than individual sort of memorization and practicing of, say, a reading practice can be integrated into math and history, and in that way becomes more relevant to the student. In addition to integrating the subject matter, then adding value through practical application of the subject matter is vital, and in particular in Alaska Native communities. Subsistence activities take up a lot of a student's time, and students miss quite a bit of school participating in these subsistence activities. This becomes a struggle for the educator because the student is missing vital class time, and a struggle for the student trying to keep up in those times that they may be away at a fish camp or on a hunt. In this way, we need to shift into looking at subsistence activities as an extension of the classroom. Students are not going to bring a math book on a hunt with them or to a fish camp with them. So we need to look at a way to educate the students within the classroom that relates directly to their activities outside of the classroom. And in this way, there would be less of a gap in learning for the student and less frustration on the part of the teacher for the student's absence. Community participation is vital in this two-way transaction that I've mentioned. Not only just in the participation of running the school from day to day, but also in the development of curriculum and in the physical presence of the community in the classroom. This requires us to shift from a normal Western framework of classroom setting into a community setting. The walls of the classroom, it's not enough to bring in a guest speaker or read books about the local area. We need to shift from the classroom walls out into the community. This not only increases community investment in the education because they can see that the students are learning in a more deep and meaningful way about their community, but it also increases the students' investment in their community. They begin to be able to perform public services, understand the way that the community works, the cultural implications of various mechanisms of the community. And it creates a true cultural exchange and a true partnership between the education system and the community in which it's located. The effect of global influence on Alaska Native communities has been vast, starting with first contact and bringing us up into modern life. This is something that is readily apparent in the education system, in the strictly Western classroom settings and ways of teaching based on state and national standards, rather than taking into account the local community in which those standards are being applied. Part of the struggle for modern Alaska natives is wage earning and subsistence living, and how to integrate both of those very important parts of life into the day-to-day life. For students, this can create a very complicated sort of dichotomy, not only in their education and the time that they miss in subsistence living, and the necessity of learning skills in order to earn wages in the future. Modern necessities need to be integrated with the traditional ways. This is something that the adults in these villages are struggling with, and something that we can raise the students to struggle with less, hopefully, in the future. One example that I cited in my final paper is a caribou lesson plan, in which the students in the classroom would study herd counts. They would speak with community members about past herd counts and patterns of the caribou herds, and then they would take that knowledge and that history out onto a hunt with them. When they return, they could report back to the class about the actual numbers, tell stories of the hunt, and this lesson would integrate history, culture, math, reading, every subject. This is truly integrated and holistic learning that can be applied when the student is outside of the classroom. This community, seeing the student apply these things outside of the classroom, can then see the value in the education system rather than fighting against it the way that wage earning and subsistence living often fight against each other. This will allow the students to see that it is possible to integrate modern living into village life, and that the two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. In my caribou lesson plan, I also gave the example integrating modern life by doing fuel counts and how much fuel was necessary to go out on a hunt, and what various kind of modern necessities were needed for that hunt. And in that way, that combines both, the modern living as well as the traditional hunts and the history of the area. Alaska Native teacher training is something that is not focused on nearly enough. Teacher turnover rates in rural communities in Alaska are 52%. This creates not only a gap in the education for the students, but also, especially in Alaska Native communities, many classrooms are multi-grade. So potentially with teacher retention, a student could have the same teacher for 3 years in a row. So it creates a gap in learning for those students that may have had that teacher for more than 1 year, and it also creates a lack of trust within the community. These teachers come in for a year, face the difficulties both of physical living in rural communities in Alaska, as well as the struggle of integrating Western education into that community. Alaska trained teachers are less likely to leave positions than Alaska people who have lived in Alaska their entire lives are even less likely to leave their positions within the first few years. Um, this is really important because with both Alaska Native teachers and teachers who have been raised in Alaska, who may not necessarily be Alaska Natives, they create a trust and carry with them much more traditional knowledge of the local areas in which they're teaching. This means that they require less training in local culture, and that they are more invested in the area. For all teachers who are planning on or currently teaching in rural Alaska Native communities, continued cultural training is vital. Part of this is partnership with the community, and part of it also needs to be integrated into the university level education system. In conclusion, we must start expanding our view of education in general in the United States and in Alaska Native communities in particular, expanding the scope of knowledge from fact-based focus to holistic learning and community value. If we can shift this focus, then I believe that we will raise a generation of students that are more invested in their education and more invested in their community, and foster a community that is more invested in their students. Thank you very much for listening.